Facebook's 2 billion users may soon notice major changes to their news feed. Users will start to see more posts from friends and family and less content from brands and organizations.
This comes as Facebook addresses fallout from fake news posts during the 2016 presidential election. Earlier, we talked with CBSN contributor and Signal writer for G0 Media, Gabe Lipton, about what this means for the website and its future.
What makes this new development from Facebook so interesting is I think it's having different effects in different parts of the world. So in the U.S., like you mentioned, we have this anger, this disdain, especially since last year's election, about the proliferation of fake news. Now, Facebook responded to this last week by saying, like you mentioned, we're going to allow more news from friends and family. We're going to cut off, more official news sources, so that you're only being exposed to different types of news, different types of media. But in other countries, in countries where there aren't major media organizations, people really use Facebook as their main source of news. They use, media organizations publish through Facebook. They can't fund print media, so people are only getting stuff through social media. And so these changes are really affecting these smaller news organizations. And it remains to be seen if this is good or bad for freedom of press in these countries, if it's good or bad for the ability of democracy in these countries. And so I think there's a broader story here about the unintended consequences of technology, about big organizations that we can't quite get a handle on, making decisions that they don't know what the impact will be of them will be. And again, it remains to be seen what these changes at Facebook mean. But again, this distrust for these big organizations, the sense that they need to be regulated, that they need to be reformed, I don't think is going anywhere.
And what about the news organizations, not the small ones that you're talking about, in countries where the freedom of the press is not as strong as it is here, those news organizations who signed on with Facebook in the hopes that by getting eyeballs onto their site through Facebook that it would lead to greater revenues, are they sort of going to be pushed by the wayside now? I'm specifically thinking about, I think the Daily Beast was offered a deal on Facebook and they sort of said no, and everybody back then said you're crazy because you're going to drive so much traffic to your site, and now they're sitting there going, you see, I would have been.
We told you. No, look, I think this news is definitely a hit for these sort of non-traditional media organizations that saw Facebook as a platform to get their stuff out there. There's no doubt about it. And I think a lot of the revenue model that those organizations are based on, they need Facebook, they need those eyeballs. But again, I think it's not just about those organizations. It's about this broader media landscape changing and shifting, and people's sort of trust of traditional media news sources, which is so important. It's so integral, especially in countries where that's never existed, in countries where people have never really had a major news organization that they can trust and rely on, but they're just starting to get it on social media. Now that might disappear. What's happening next?
Here's what I feel. I don't know what the fallout of this is going to be, changing of this algorithm, but I feel like Facebook was never intended to be a news outlet. And we're sort of criticizing it for not being very good at it. But if you want to continue with the analogy of Times Square when it was sort of cruddy, it's not a place that you would have taken your children to. Facebook is supposed to be a place where you show, grandma that the kid graduated from kindergarten, or you and your girls had a great night out.
That's what it
was.
Right,
and that's what it's supposed to be. And now sort of we're all up in arms that it's not providing news properly. I feel like if this algorithm, if what seems to be behind it is, if the motivation is to bring it back to what it was before, which is connecting with friends and family, I think this is a good thing. And perhaps there needs to be another page for people who want to disseminate news, false or otherwise.
Yes.
Look, that you're absolutely right, but the newspaper industry in this country, people forget, did not start because there was some kind of altruistic notion of journalism. It started because the companies that sold soap and sold cereal said, how can we get more people to buy our products? Why don't we put the advertisement and give a little bit of news about what's going on in their community? That's how journalism, at least back in the 17th and 18th century, started in Western countries, which was advertising. People tend to forget that they sort of imagine that it was the news that drove the advertising. It was always the advertising that drove the news. But at some point, the New York Times said, we have a mission. Washington Post said we have a mission, and newspapers across the country said we are going to take on this mission. It's the same thing, I'd argue, with Facebook. It may have started as a platform to disseminate cat videos and what you were eating day. But it has now become, as you point out, Gabe, a platform where people get their news.
So they're trying to scale it back.
They're trying to scale it back
to what it was originally.
And if they don't accept that responsibility, I think that's an issue.
I think so too. I mean, I think the one difference about sort of traditional news media, and you make a good point, Vlad, is that news is also getting more targeted. It's not that you're getting everything in the newspaper. It's that you're getting news based on your preferences, based on what you like, based on who you're friends with.
Right.
I think that's where we get into some problematic territory, and where people start to distrust these sort of non-traditional
Because if all
entities.
your friends are left-wing extremists, and that's what is going to appear in your news feed, your worldview is going to shrink simply just based on the people that you interact with on Facebook.
Exactly.
That's why you don't get your news from Facebook. Get it here. CBSN.
That's right.
A source you can trust. All right, let's move on to hard numbers before we let you go, Gabe. You got a bunch of great hard numbers from sort of smattering from all over the world. We're going to start with 386. This has to do with Venezuela?
So 300, this is amazing. Between January 1st and January 11th, 386 protests have taken place in Venezuela regarding the miserable state of the country, and in particular the fact that a lot of people are going without food. I think that the reality in Venezuela is not going to change overnight. President Maduro has a pretty tight grip on the country. The military supports him, but I think we have to look at statistics like this and think, wow, what's going on there is really tough. We hope that there can be some solution that allows these people to get resources they need to improve their lives.
Yeah.
All right, 40% of the population of sub-Saharan Africa, or nearly 400 million people, live in urban areas.
Yeah, this is amazing to me. I mean, and that's supposed to double in the next 25 years. So by, that's going to be doubled to 80. I think one thing every country struggles with, especially countries that don't have a lot of high GDP, is creating resources, creating infrastructure for their people to live. If you're talking about countries that have 40% of their population living in major cities, that's going to create a lot of problems, a lot of tensions. How do these governments deliver when they don't have the resources or the trust of their people? That's a big question.
Okay, so the last two numbers I thought were really interesting. We've been talking about Salvadorans in the news, how they here are going to be losing their temporary immigration protections. 17% of the country's GDP, El Salvador, the GDP comes from remittances from Americans.
That is an amazing thing. I mean, as you mentioned, the Trump administration has revoked TPS for a lot of Salvadorians. That means that a lot of these people are going to be returning to El Salvador. And yes, 17% of the country's GDP comes from remittances. We tend to think about the impact of immigration here in the U.S., but this also has a huge impact on those countries those people are going back to. When those remittances aren't appearing on a monthly or weekly basis, what does that mean for people's lives? What does that mean for the country? It's a big issue.
And the final number you have here, a new Starbucks opens in China every 15 hours, but a agricultural census in China found 314 million people. That's 40% of the country's workforce was employed in farming in 2016. What's the correlation there?
Look, countries across the world are seeing a divide between urban and rural populations. That creates all sorts of trouble. We mentioned it in sub-Saharan Africa. It creates a lot of divides politically. The fact of the matter that 15 Starbucks are opening every day, I mean, that's staggering, but still 40% of the population in China is working on farms. I mean, I think it speaks to the divide there, the sense that there may be growing inequalities. That can create instability. It can create anger at the government. How this plays out is an open question, but I think it just speaks to this sort of growing divide in China, but also elsewhere in the developing world.
But I've seen statistics that point out that the numbers of people going from farms to cities in China is something on an unimaginable scale that we couldn't compare in the United States. Millions of people, right?
Undeniable.
Same thing as Africa, as you were mentioning, right?
Exactly. I mean, it's undeniable. I think something like 200 million people have risen out of poverty in China over the last decade. That's an amazing thing. But I think even as that happens, governments, not just in China but elsewhere, face this fundamental question: how do we deal with those people that are still in rural areas, who are still impoverished, and that creates, again, problems for governance, problems for those societies.
I was just shocked because I was like, this is the country of tea. What is Starbucks doing?
I know.
Making inroads there,
I know.
right? Gabe Lipton, thank you so much.
Guys, it's great to be with you. Thanks so much.